And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's chair, Liane Feldman, Dr. Feldman, to you. She is coming in for this session to chair it, and Dr. Feldman is the Edward W. Archibald Professor and Chair of the Department of Surgery at McGill. And in January 2020, she was the first female surgeon-in-chief and is the medical director of the surgical mission at the McGill University Health Center, MUHC. The clinical focus of Dr. Feldman and her research team is to investigate multidisciplinary surgical outcomes. So she's taking into account surgery, anesthesiology, clinical epidemiology, exercise, physiology, nutrition, and psychology. She and her team are specifically looking for ways to improve recovery post-laparoscopic gastrointestinal surgery, and they carry out clinical trials examining the effectiveness of such interventions as prehabilitation, exercise, nutrition, minimally invasive surgery, enhanced recovery pathways, as well as mobile applications aimed at improving recovery and all aspects of patient well-being. Her highly qualified team also contributes to safer surgery through the development of department-wide implementation of innovative patient-centered perioperative care plans, educational curricula, simulation and assessment tools, and focus specifically on image-based surgical techniques. So there's a lot of expertise here also concerning our main topics today. So thanks for joining us, Liane, and I give the floor to you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to hearing our speakers this afternoon and learning from you all. It's my honor to be able to moderate the discussion as well and to introduce our first speaker of the afternoon, Professor Richard Mizelle, Jr., who's Associate Professor of History at the University of Houston, Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of History, whose research focuses on historical understandings of health and healthcare politics, medical citizenship, environmentalism and health, medical technology, race, gender, and ethnicity in medicine, and the transformation of disease identity. Dr. Mizelle has organized and produced higher education teaching modules on the history of race, medicine, and the environment for the U.S. National Library of Medicine exhibition program, and is guest curator for the National Library of Medicine Traveling Exhibition Program. Professor Mizelle will be speaking to us on debts, dialysis, and consumer demand for a life-sustaining technology.
Okay, well, thank you again, Liane, and I also want to thank Rachel and Thomas for organizing this. It's been a wonderful 2 days. I have at times been a part of organizing workshops, and so I know how much work and time and energy it can be. So thank you so much. I want to do a couple of things today in fairly short order. Just have a few slides, really. I thought that I would talk a little bit about my current book project and a few of my recent publications coming out of the broader work and providing an aerial view, so to speak. Number one, and secondly, frame just a bit of the essay on the Seattle Artificial Kidney Center that you have before you and some ideas of what I think about it. And I thought about doing it this way because I thought that would give you a little bit more of an inclination or thought of where I'm coming from in terms of this particular essay and article, which is a spinoff of my broader work on the history of diabetes. So I am, as Liane noted, I am a historian of race, medicine, environment, and early on technology, though I'm now coming back to sort of thinking about questions of technology. But I'm currently writing a history of race and diabetes from the turn of the 20th century through the current SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. As I say in other venues, diabetes really narrates the 20th century. There's no part of the history of the 20th century America that diabetes does not narrate. From the Progressive Era, Great Migration, Depression, New Deal, World War I, World War II, Civil Rights, Black Power, post-Civil Rights era. Diabetes has an impact on all of these particular moments in the 20th century. And I'm at a very interesting point in this book where, not only do I know what the book is about, perhaps what's even more liberating, I know what the book is not about. And when you get to that point, you start to feel really good. So some of the major themes of this broader work, transformation of disease identity, is well known to historians of medicine. African Americans, Blacks were largely considered to be immune to diabetes. In the early 20th century, diabetes was considered to be a disease of whiteness and civilization. Of course, that was incorrect. My work pivots on not showing that African Americans were suffering from diabetes too. That much is obvious. But thinking about these questions of ignorance making and the unmaking of knowledge, why don't we know what we don't know? And, what are the sort of scientific networks in place to keep some of these conversations and these imaginations silent? And what are the racial projects at work in terms of making African Americans invisible in the broader scientific archive? My work also speaks to questions of migration and health activism. Myself and Sam Roberts and Amina Shakir and others, we all sort of write within this sort of theme of thinking about migration and health, that migration has been woefully under-theorized in the context of health activism, that Black people moved and migrated for a number of different reasons, including better obstetric care, better health care, care for chronic disease and illness, but also movement back and forth temporarily in search of healthcare, right? So for example, in Atlanta, sometimes African Americans might go to New York for healthcare around diabetes and then come back. So these questions of movement and migration also animate the broader book, and also the civil rights Black Power movement. That movement, that era, was also a health movement, as there was an increasing focus on the broader considerations of health and health politics and those diseases and illnesses that were impacting African Americans. As I mentioned yesterday, yesterday, my project also pivots on decentering white male physicians as the only way of knowing for these questions of diabetes activism, understandings, and sort of thinking about these broader questions of health and illness. I make the point in my broader argument that for many African Americans, particularly in the South and other parts of the country, they might well have come into contact with the nurse before a physician in the early 20th century. But also other questions of the role of dietitians and other professionals beyond the white male dominated medical world. So that said, I am very much interested in the complications of diabetes, chronic kidney failure, dialysis, heart disease, amputations, blindness, physical disability, diabetic headache as a window into chronic diabetes. These complications tell us a lot about the long and tortured history of the disease. My first book dealt with sort of environmentalism and a little bit of public health and a little bit of technology. But in the form of technology, I was thinking about levees and sort of the failure of levees and how we can understand that within the terrain of sort of this broader environmental consciousness. But what also this technology meant in the lives and sort of the consciousness of people who were forced to live beside these massive structures. But also blues technology, thinking about records and sort of race records and sort of the dissemination, sociology of knowledge produced and disseminated across the country and across the world. So I think about these questions of music and intersectionality within environmental racism and public health and migration. I did so in my first book, and I will continue that with my second book as well, thinking about these questions of music and intersectionality, what it tells us about technology, what it tells us about public health and medicine. B.B. King, of course, well known for his struggles with diabetes. Cannonball Adderley on the My Right. Interesting because, for some, the perception was that he was probably type 2 diabetic. He was a type 2 diabetic, but he actually might have been a long undiagnosed type 1 diabetic. So it raises all of these interesting questions about slippages between type 1 and type 2. Of course, the idea of type 1 and type 2 diabetes does not come about until the 1950s, and increasing focus on autoimmune diseases. But also, importantly, the struggle of particularly Black type 1 diabetics to gain recognition within the medical marketplace. There's still this perception that African Americans only suffer from type 2 diabetes and not type 1. And on my left, Malik Taylor, AKA Fife Dog of the hip hop group A Tribe Called Quest, who in 1993 released a song as part of his group called Oh My God for the album Midnight Marauders. Malik Taylor was a sufferer of diabetes. And in this particular song, he says, when was the last time you heard from a funky diabetic? And in a documentary some years later in 2016, he talked about this lyric and he said, well, it was an accurate representation of my body, but it was also a lyric that sounded good. But he didn't realize, of course, how his lyric would sort of intersect with sort of this knowledge production around diabetes. I was probably in high school. I was in high school in 1993 when that song came out, and I'm sure I uttered it 1,000 times. I don't think I knew what diabetes was back then, but I don't remember. But his uttering that lyric in many ways helped to sort of usher in a new conversation among a new generation about, the struggles of dialysis and kidney failure and diabetes. Malik Taylor, of course, died, unfortunately, in 2016 from kidney-related complications to diabetes. And so the documentary was a couple of years before that. So this project takes me to historical archives in the United States and Canada, looking at historical archives, federal, state, public health, hospital records, city records, census, manuscript collections, interviews, oral history, physician, patient records, and nursing records, the toolkit of historians, right? So I bring it all in as a way of sort of thinking about these questions, but focusing quite a bit on patient records, but also the absences of patient records, which I'll talk about in a moment. So one of the pieces that I also recently wrote a year ago, a little bit more, was on Katrina diabetes and the meaning of resiliency, where I talk about, among other things, dialysis and the difficulties that dialysis patients had in evacuating the storm, sort of ways in which that they were constricted in movement and evacuation because of their dependency on this technology, how many had to break into vending machines and consume fruit punch or other sugary items to stave off diabetic shock. How once in these evacuation shelters, they lacked insulin, but also lacked diabetic-friendly foods in ways that made it difficult to manage their disease. Unlike other chronic diseases, diabetes is a disease that incurs a certain amount of self-actualization and self-care. So these broader questions of the dependency on technology, dependency on dialysis, the difficulty it meant for them to evacuate and for their families to evacuate. All of those questions were front and center for me in this particular piece. Piece I also just recently wrote was on diabetes, race, and amputations for the Lancet. And just to spend a little moment on this, because this in some ways really speaks to my growing interest once again in technology. Diabetic amputations represent an epidemic within an epidemic. Uncontrolled diabetes causes severe nerve damage and hardening of blood vessels that restrict the flow of blood to the lower extremities. Restriction of blood and nerve damage leads to gangrene, infections, foot ulcers, and peripheral arterial disease. Surprisingly, diabetics who suffer high amputations or amputations above the knee can have a shorter life expectancy than most forms of diagnosed cancer. So I offer, what is it about suffering an amputation that so drastically decreases life expectancy? The nerve damage, hardening of walls, and general arteriosclerosis that necessitates an amputation often occurs in other parts of the body, including vessels to and from the heart, making uncontrolled diabetics vulnerable to chronic heart disease, massive heart attack, and stroke. To put bluntly, amputations are in many ways an inward sign of the devastation that diabetes is wreaking in the body. There are close to 140,000 diabetic-related amputations every year, and Black people are more than 4 times likely to suffer an amputation. Low rates of angiogram screening for nerve damage and PAD leads to unnecessary amputations. Zip codes tell the story, as residents in low-income and neglected neighborhoods suffer amputations at rates double that of higher incomes. Diabetics living in poor and segregated neighborhoods experience a constellation of social factors that lead to risk of amputations, including being uninsured, underinsured, high insulin costs, and lack of access to revascularization surgeons. So, this essay in some ways marks a turning point in my career. At this point, I am sort of solidly mid-career. And as a sort of mid-career scholar, I'm becoming increasingly active, more active, I should say, in sort of thinking about how my work can influence patient populations, but also policy. So I'm becoming much more forceful in talking about the need for generic insulin, stigma of dialysis, these amputation epidemics within an epidemic. And so this piece in some ways signals that, but also focusing on disability and what artificial limbs have to tell us about technology, but also vulnerability and stigma. Very quickly, amputations are financially expensive. Prosthetic limbs can cost up to $50,000, require replacement every 3 to 5 years to account for changes in the body, and demand months of physical therapy that can be very costly. Medicare and many Medicaid plans cover prosthetics, though the bureaucratic enrollment and state eligibility requirements for the latter can make access difficult. Prosthetics also speak to questions of race and technology. Far from apolitical technologies, prosthetics tell us something about whiteness as the constructed technological norm and the politics of user identity. For Black people, the stigma of amputations in public spaces can become exacerbated by the inability to find prosthetic limbs to match their skin color, forcing the use of pants, and for women to sometimes wear dark stockings, even in the summertime. Foot shells, as you see here, are the covers made to look like human feet for prosthetic limbs. And they can also be difficult to find in colors other than white for those without resources. There is pain and frustration here for people who are non-white, but out of necessity are forced to walk around with a white prosthetic limb on their non-white bodies. Like many in this room, I have thought quite a bit about Langdon Winner's The Well and the Reactor, Search for Limits in an Age of High Technology. Social theorist Winner asked the question in 1997, do artifacts have politics, influencing a generation of scholarship on the meaning of technology and society? Winner argues that technology is inherently political in that it reflects human bias in both design and application. At issue is the claim that the machine structures and systems of modern culture can be accurately judged not only for their contributions to efficiency and productivity, but also for the ways in which they can embody specific forms of power and authority. More recently, sociologist Ruha Benjamin argues of a theoretical new Jim Code, where supposedly neutral technological systems and fixes often obscure social distinctions and racial discrimination. She defines the theory as the employment of new technologies that reflect and reproduce existing inequalities, but that are promoted and perceived as more objective or progressive than the discriminatory systems of a previous era. Technological systems that ignore broader conversations of social distinctions embedded in the era in which they emerge ultimately deepens the fissure of racism in what Benjamin describes as default discrimination. And I talk about that a little bit in my paper, and that's sort of a guiding sort of theory, one of the guiding theories of my paper. If you haven't read Ruha Benjamin, treat yourself. It's a wonderful sort of analysis of various aspects of race and technology. And as you might imagine, more recently, I've been brought into conversations around SARS and COVID-2 and diabetes. I'm thinking about what happens when a sudden pandemic in SARS-CoV-2 meets an old metabolic disease in diabetes. The presence of diabetes is clearly one of the more dangerous comorbidities of COVID-19, as just one example. Diabetes causes body inflammation and weakens the immune system to fight viruses and infections. Particularly for type 2 diabetics, but also for type 1, obesity is an added layer that makes a dual diagnosis of diabetes and COVID-19 dangerous. Obesity prompts a continual response from your immune system or chronic inflammatory status that can make individuals susceptible to viruses and bacteria. So with that background, brings me to what you have before you today. And I became interested in dialysis quite some time ago, just reading and doing research and becoming more sort of familiar with the history of diabetes, but also end-stage renal disease and kidney failure. And I don't remember exactly when I first came across this medical committee that supposedly existed in 1962 in Seattle, but I was always fascinated by it and wanted to know more. But there did not seem to be much in the way of secondary research or other information about it. And I, sort of cast a wide net and didn't find much, and then decided to put it aside. But I was fascinated about the rumors of this life and death committee, where supposedly ordinary citizens made decisions about who would have access to dialysis. In Seattle, when the first outpatient artificial dialysis center was opened, which was known as the Seattle Artificial Kidney Center, there was a medical supply issue or a capitalism issue where there were more people who needed dialysis than there were machines who could offer this form of treatment. And also dialysis was prohibitively expensive. So as a response, this committee was constructed to make decisions. And some of what people said early was that, mostly white, if you were Christian, if you were middle class, these were, if you were a male, these were the components that made it more likely for you to receive one of these coveted spots. So I put the article aside and I began to really just research diabetes, but it was always in the back of my mind. And a couple of years ago now, it's hard to remember with COVID time, but I think 3 years ago now, I was in the Bates Center archive at UPenn, and I came across the papers of Jane Albers, who, as it turned out, was the first nurse and the head nurse of the Seattle Artificial Kidney Center. And she was in her interviews talking about the Seattle Artificial Kidney Center. And that sort of reignited my interest in this. I was supposed to be researching diabetes, but I ended up researching for this particular article for a day or two. And for me, it was well worth it. Because it sort of, stuck in my craw. And as I began to really think about these questions of worthy and unworthy sufferers. And I began to think about this essay, and also then traveled again to Washington, to the University of Washington in Seattle, and looked at the papers of Belding Scribner, who was the first, who was the founding physician, nephrologist of the Seattle Artificial Kidney Center. And it would become clear to me that there was a story there that needed to be told. And I set out to really begin to tell this story as not only a question of sort of medical decision-making, but also ethics, migration, and racial theory. So part of how this works was that there were actually two committees in Seattle. There was what was called the Medical Advisory Committee and the Admissions and Policy Committee, which has been called a number of things: the committee, the Physicians Committee, the God Committee. It has a number of nicknames. But the way that it was set up was that candidates first had to go through a Medical Advisory Committee who put together a set of frameworks. In other words, they couldn't be younger than 15 or 18 and older than 50. Thinking that if someone was under 15, that they wouldn't have the maturity to deal with dialysis. And if older than 50, then it would likely have another underlying disease. They also made the recommendation that only people suffering from kidney failure without other medical issues would be eligible. No diabetes, no high blood pressure in a certain sense. Only people who had end-stage renal disease or uremia were eligible. Also problematic was the fact that they have these IQ tests or psychological tests that each patient had to go through, which, as you might imagine, were very problematic. Many of them reeked of eugenics and sort of, essentially made a narrative of who was worthy, who would be mature enough to deal with these with dialysis. So all of these sort of questions and issues were part of the medical advisory committee. Individual patients could not apply to the medical advisory committee themselves. Only a physician could recommend a patient to the medical advisory committee, which meant that you had to have a physician, right? Which meant that you had to be in a structure and network where you had access to medical care, which was problematic to a lot of people. If you made it past the medical advisory committee, then you were passed to the admissions and policy committee, who made a number of decisions of social worth regarding who would be eligible for dialysis. And this is where it can get complicated, right? Because many of these questions sort of revolve around, questions of social worth, but also, how many children you have. What are the ages of your children? So, for example, if you had a child who, if you were in need of dialysis and your child was a teenager, you were probably not going to get dialysis if you were brought up against someone else who had a child that was 2 or 3. The argument being that the burden on the young child would be more than the burden on a teenager, right? So you had those issues. Also, what kind of job you worked. If you were in school, if you had a blue collar job, the committee seemed to favor those kinds of individuals over individuals who had positions or jobs that were required more labor. If you were an insurance company or a milkman or mailman, that could be too taxing, depending on where you worked. If you worked at Boeing, that was a plus. Boeing was in Seattle, one of the major industries in the city, but Boeing apparently at the time was well known for having a lenient policy towards those who were disabled. The problem with that, of course, is that Boeing discriminated against Black people until the 1970s, that there was a large civil rights campaign to desegregate Boeing, and most of that did not occur until the late 1960s and 1970s, right? So, these questions, where you lived, there were sort of gendered analyses within. So if you were a man who was not working while you were suffering from kidney failure, then that would be an issue for the committee. You were not sort of carrying your weight as a man and therefore not worthy of dialysis, of living. So all of these sort of ethical questions and ethical tensions are part of what makes up these sort of patient policy and admissions decisions. And so I seize on that, these questions, and sort of make a broader argument about the Seattle Artificial Kidney Center in terms of these questions of race. The death records in Kings County Hospital System were very important for me because they showed that there were many African Americans in Seattle who were suffering from uremia. And part of the argument, the broader argument that you'll see from some scholars is that race or racism was not an issue because there was not a large Black population in Seattle. And I argue against that, arguing that Seattle, of course, was no Chicago, but there was, by the 1960s, a growing Black population due to the Great Migration of African Americans migrating from Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, to the far north, in addition to Chicago and Detroit, that it was a very politically active community. Second Black Panther Party, the first chapter of the Black Panther Party outside of California, NAACP, Urban League. So they were small, but also very powerful in Seattle. And so that argument is part of what animates these questions of the structures that were put in place that made it difficult for African Americans and also other non-white groups, Asians, East Indians to gain access to these to dialysis and sort of this life-saving technology. So for me, I'm thinking about these questions in terms of ethics, in terms of migration, but also sort of pushing back on this sort of argument that this question of dialysis and race really doesn't come into focus until the 1970s, which is what some people argue, that after 1972 and the Medical Entitlement Act passed through Medicare, there was this explosion of dialysis patients in Black communities. I argue no, there were sort of long ignored populations of Black people who were suffering from dialysis, suffering from kidney failure, suffering from uremia, and in need of dialysis for much of the 20th century. So the piece that you have in front of you is a piece I've been working on for quite some time. Apologize for it being so long. I was reading it last night and I was like, sheesh, this is pretty long. I think I'll definitely be happy to hear any comments that you have from it. I think personally that I probably could do more with the question of ethics than I do in the paper, but also some other sort of moral and ethical issues, questions that arise that I could probably deal with a little bit more. And so I'll stop there, and I look forward to hearing any of your comments and questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's really so much to think about. I didn't think your piece was too long, and I really enjoyed reading it. So I think we're going to have some questions, and we'll take some questions from the chat. We have from Rachel Elder question. Start off.
Sorry, I keep sneaking in with the first question. So if anybody else would like to go first. Okay. Well, thank you for that. I really liked the treatment of all the invisible barriers to treatment. I thought that was really well done. And I'm interested in the committee itself, in part in this annoying way, because I see parallels with my own work, which partially looks at how the first drivers with epilepsy gained licenses and went through these medical review boards in the 1940s. So I'm interested in what those records look like and some of the other criteria for approval for dialysis. I don't know if the applicant was ever present in front of the board, for example. That was the case with people with epilepsy for driver's licenses, because part of the idea was to sort of evaluate the respectability of the candidate on the spot. More so than to assess their level of seizure control, for example. So were they present? What do those records look like? Have you been able to get at, you talked about oral histories. Have you been able to find any sources to kind of get at the patients and prospective patients themselves?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. How the individual committee members were chosen is not clear. There's a lot about this that quite frankly is not clear. The committee was visible and invisible at the same time. Like in some ways, they operated in the shadows. It seems like they didn't want their identities known. I know some of their identities, that I've sort of pulled out of the records, the names, the Life magazine piece, talks a lot about some of their names, and I've seen some of their names in other publications, but for some of them, they were associated, but did not want to be associated in terms of publicly. But on the other hand, it operated like any other business, right? Like any other meeting, like they had minutes. So I got a lot of the really interesting stuff from the death records and the meeting minutes, which were just like any other meeting you would have at a departmental meeting with a quorum, with a discussion, majority rules, and so I think those minutes were sort of what sort of animated much of the argument that I make. Because you would have patient 5 versus patient 8. They don't have the names of the patients in the minutes, but they would say patient 5 was a milkman with 2 children. Patient 8 was an insurance agent with 4 children. Patient 5 was a woman. Patient 8 was a man. And they would also say the committee talked about this, they deliberated, and they chose patient number 5. There are also these candidate forms that were in the archive as well. And on those candidate forms, you have, and this is very, again, eugenic-like, occupation, parents' occupation, sort of, medical ID, sort of medical evaluation, all of these sort of questions and issues. And there were, in some instances where, the argument against a particular patient was that, well, their parents were poor, and the parents before that were poor. So it sort of reeked of this sort of Buck v. Bell, 3 generations are enough, and this person should not get dialysis because they're not worthy and their lineage is not worthy of dialysis. And I actually think I can, make a little bit more of that as well. As far as your last question, as far as the patients, no. I mean, there's very little of the patients in the archive. And, as a historian of my first book, and I should have mentioned this, I deal a lot with the archive. I have a tendency to pick projects with, few archival records from the individuals I'm studying. And that's part of doing work on Black people, particularly in the early 20th century. I've thought a lot about this with my first project, where I spend a certain amount of the book thinking about the ideological archive and, building on sort of works that have talked about the violence within the archive, that there's a reason why there's not more voices of African Americans in the archive of the 1927 flood, which is to say that at a moment in which people were interviewing, conducting oral histories, Black survivors were ignored. And I see the same thing with the diabetes book as well. I think of patient records as narratives, not simply as clinical encounters, that the ways in which physicians sort of describe and talk about patients, what they ignore, what they dismiss, what they tend to front load, all of that is part of the narrative. So there's not a lot of archival research that I have seen on this topic, quite frankly, Rachel. I mean, I think that I've thought about going back to Seattle 1 or 2 more times after the pandemic, maybe to see what else I can dig up. But this is mostly what I have. And, after sort of a couple of years of research, that kind of is front and center. And so for that, I rely a lot on theory, medical theory, technological theory, sort of course, Lundy Braun's work, Rayvon Fouche, Irving Goffman, Frantz Fanon, these theorists sort of help me to make these broader connections that are sort of that connect the invisibilities of the archive.
Do we have any other questions from the chat? If not, maybe I can ask you a question, Richard, if you don't mind. So I think much of what you said, resonates for sure in the time of where we've had to question allocation of scarce resources in the midst of the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. And here in Quebec, when we were in the second wave early on in this winter, when the ICUs were really reaching a certain capacity, there were actually framework and ethical protocols that were put into place for us on the clinical side if we had to come to the point where we were really provincially facing an overload of our system. We didn't get there, thankfully. Maybe part of announcing that has an impact on decisions that people make in terms of their own risks. But it struck me that, just the concept of how you go about, what's the framework for allocation of scarce resources. And this framework was explicitly, a public health, the benefit to the most people versus a benefit to an individual. And the way that these teams of people that were meant to be set up in each hospital, and that we actually had to set up in anticipation of it, which was very difficult on the clinical side to even wrap your head around that. but it did give explicit criteria. We never had to use it. I was just wondering if you thought, we're still faced with these issues, and particularly in this past year, this was real. What would you recommend? I mean, as a historian and with this information and how, the enormous risks that are potential with these decisions that are made as you laid out. Have we made progress? Is that we're faced with it this time? Did we learn from Katrina? Have we learned from the histories of some of the experiences that you bring out?
Yeah, I mean, I would say yes and no. I mean, I've thought a lot about scarce resources of kidneys, and sort of transplants, and who makes it to the top of the list, and what resources can, how resources can play an impact or play an important role on who has first chance and even second, third chance of life. I think that any framework that hinges on questions of worth are inherently flawed, inherently biased, because it will inevitably run the risk of discriminating against certain people in certain spaces. And so I think that there has to be a framework where everyone is evaluated in a scenario that provides equality. And if that is not actively done, then we run the risk of sort of leading to discrimination in scarce resources. And yes, I definitely thought about this. I was writing part of this last year at this time, really, when some of these larger questions of access to beds here in the United States, whether you were going to get a ventilator, back when ventilators was thought of as the thing that would save people's lives. All of these questions began to come out, in certain areas in the Bronx and in Brooklyn, that you would not be able to get a ventilator if you were Black or if you were a certain age. And, some physicians actually came out and said this, that we might have to begin sort of leaning towards people who we think will benefit the most from this, i.e., younger people with better health backgrounds. So all of those issues are questions are problematic. And I think that there's, people who are constantly weighing out against those things, but they still occur, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I think we have time for one last comment. Elizabeth?
Well, actually, I was about to make the question you made, but because I did a presentation to the board on it, and I think maybe Richard doesn't realize is probably the most contentious part was taking people off ventilators. And so it's a very fair, it's based on human rights. You're not allowed to deal with race, age, anything else. The goal is you look at the likelihood of good years left or how many lifetimes left. The problem is anybody who would come, and I actually fully accepted it, because the problem, the ones who are fighting against it identified that their loved one would be on the ventilator and be taken off, as opposed to their loved one being in the ER and not getting on a ventilator. And so it's very difficult, and maybe actually at some stage you should look at what was proposed by Quebec, because I would be very interested to see what you would think of it, because it didn't actually come into place, but it was really, it brought out the most extreme for and against people. People were very upset, because when I was talking to the board, there was 4 or 5 people who were really upset with the idea. And yet I know in surgery, you make these decisions all the time. In medicine, we make these decisions all the time, but it's usually doctor-based. It sometimes goes to tumor boards, like if you're looking at who gets what, but I know during COVID, a lot of people didn't get OR time. Like I know it, because I used to be also on the prioritization committee for who got access to the OR. Like, I don't know how many ORs you had going in the QSIM, but at one stage we had 5 and sometimes 6. And, like if you look at the emergencies, there were so many people bumped, and these were dealt with by a very small group of people. And so maybe it would be interesting for you to really come up with a framework of what you think would be reasonable, since you're unbiased, and how do you actually do the blind justice, and how do you, because I think I would love to hear someone who's not a doctor how you could go about making those decisions, because I know you make them all the time. I know in surgery you decide, I will operate on this person because they've got a better chance of surviving versus this person, or I'm going to let somebody have their gallbladder out who's been waiting for 2 years, or their hip replaced, as opposed to this person who's got, well, in our place, colon cancer, and they can wait for another 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 6 weeks, or you can get your breast reconstructed as of now, as opposed to 2 years. Like, it's a very difficult situation.
No, I agree, and I'm definitely very much aware of the debates on taking people off the ventilators. That was, a big issue as well. Like, when is it a situation where a person is not going to improve when family members want the person to stay on the ventilator for obvious reasons, and the hospital decides to take them off? Those conversations were here in the United States, and I'm definitely aware of those as well. But that's what's interesting too about what Rachel was saying as well. The fact that this was in 1960 a civilian committee, mm-hmm. which that kind of stuff didn't happen until the 1990s, where you have a civilian committee making decisions on who is going to have life or who's going to unfortunately be locked out of technology. And that conversation, I don't think, has been given enough credence in terms of medicine and public health and ethics. And yeah, I think that, we all need to work, myself included, on these questions of policy. And I think it is a difficult decision to make equitable decisions about who has access based on a number of different platforms. But I think that's the hard work that we all need to make. And I'm definitely have been a part in the past, and look forward to being a part of some of those conversations in the future.
I just think that these kinds of perspectives, speaking just on the clinical side, are so interesting, and we certainly it's great to see a publication in something like Lancet, because it does reach that kind of clinical audience and maybe makes you think in a different way of the issues that that have been mentioned, that we do deal with every day, but perhaps we don't reflect on them in the way that we need to. And some of these things have really been brought, the disparities, especially in access to healthcare, it's got to be one of the main themes of this past 14 months. And hopefully we learn something from it, and at least some attention and reflection is paid to it at a bare minimum.
Yeah, I was very excited about the Lancet piece, if you couldn't tell.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Lancet, that's pretty good. Yeah. So congratulations.